So these four strategies in the in this framing of it are protect people, which is what we're focused on tonight, thinking about harm reduction and how do we best protect targeted people. Disrupt and disobey, so strategizing acts to support disobedience and protest policy, defending our civic institutions, how do we safeguard democratic institutions like elections and other structures that support us, and building alternatives. So how do we think about parallel institutions, new culture building, alternative party platforms for folks doing election work? I think a lot of the work of mutual aid across the ROP network also fits into this bucket. So we've been really sitting with and thinking about these four strategies and how do we be moving together in alignment while also giving folks room to find their piece of the work within these strategies, and recognizing that all of it is beneficial, each of the roles that we play across these strategies. So this is kind of what we've been chatting about together. If you haven't read the article, feel free to check it out if it calls to you. We've been finding it, like I said, really useful. And tonight we've asked, as Emma mentioned, Reyna from Pikun and Tess from Innovation Law Lab to join us. And we're just going to have a little bit of a conversation about what protecting people looks like in this moment. So Reyna and Tess are going to join me. And we're going to get them spotlighted in just a second. And then when that happens, I'll let them do a little bit more of a personal introduction about themselves. Thanks for asking. We'll also be sure to send it out in the follow-up email about this Zoom too. So if you don't catch it somehow in the chat box, we'll make sure it gets to y'all that way too. Totally. Okay, so we're getting Tess and Reyna spotlighted. Tess, you're spotlighted. Do you want to go ahead and do a little quick introduction? Oh, good. And there's Reyna too. And then Reyna, you can introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Yes, it's wonderful to be here with everyone. My name is Tess Helgren. I'm an immigrant rights attorney and director of legal advocacy at Innovation Law Lab. I use she, her pronouns. I actually am coming to you remotely. I am based out in Gainesville, Florida. So I think also being in the state, I have a particular appreciation for the context of Oregon as well. Innovation Law Lab is an organization that combines law, organizing, and technology to advance migrant justice. And so we're trying to think of creative strategies, combining these different tools in our toolkit and applying them to the challenges at hand. And Reyna, I'll pass to you.
Hey everyone, great to be here this evening with you. I'm Reyna Lopez, she, they pronouns. I'm the executive director and president of Pikun. We're Oregon's farm worker union based out in Woodburn, Oregon. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Tess and Reyna. Appreciate that. All right, well, we're just gonna jump in and we're gonna have a little conversation. The first question I wanted to ask you all is, for the folks that you're organizing with, what do you think protecting people will look like in the months and years to come? And Reyna, I'm going to kick to you first, and then Tess will let you jump in after.
Hey, thanks. There's a lot, right? I mean, I think that one of the biggest things I wanted to make sure to share with folks today is that the power of our organizing is going to be really critical here, and to bring back a lot of the lessons we've learned from the past. Unfortunately, we have not, it's not like we've never been here. I mean, there are some things that are going to be new, but there are also, unfortunately, systems that we've had to build to protect our community. And the folks in this room, the organizations that you all support, the communities that we're a part of, we're in the best position to implement and protect our individuals, to protect our communities, and to protect our organizations. But one of the first things I wanted to really start with is the importance of narrative. We know that we heard a lot of really crappy things coming through the election, right, about the narrative of our immigrant communities. And we heard no clapbacks, no response, crickets from the Democrats. And this is why it's going to be really important that here in Oregon, we're building a very strong narrative strategy where we're all saying the same things about our immigrant community. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest, a very important strategy to keep us united and keep us, as we're organizing, keeping us in alignment. But first and foremost, through the work that Pikun's been doing, through the Oregon for All Coalition, which I'll talk a little bit more about our mission and some of the strategies that we're going to be going into, we really built up a lot of a lot of this narrative building from the One Oregon Coalition, and the One Oregon Coalition was the space that allowed us to organize and build the structures to defend Oregon from taking away our sanctuary status through the No on 105 campaign. And from that, we learned some really important core narratives that we need to continue to drive here in Oregon. One is that immigrant Oregonians are our families, they're our friends, neighbors, classmates, our colleagues. They're part of what makes Oregon strong and beautiful. And the second point is that in Oregon, we believe in caring for each other, really uplifting what we believe here in Oregon and protecting our communities against people who try to divide us. The third point really saying hardworking immigrants are part of our families, our communities, workplaces, and the places of worship, and should be safe from harassment just like any other Oregonian. And Oregonians reject harmful efforts to divide our communities and families. And the last point being that our state is enriched by the diversity of experiences, cultures, and traditions that all of us, including immigrants, bring to our communities. In addition to making sure that as we're rebuilding our narrative and really trying to amplify that throughout the state and hopefully throughout the country, really humanifying, who are immigrant communities. I mean, again, that's going back to the idea that this is our friends, these are our family members, our neighbors. We know that with the incoming presidential administration, our immigrant and refugee communities are going to be at great risk. The new administration has vowed to execute mass deportations, and while we don't know exactly how that's going to be accomplished, we can look back into the past to prepare tools for the future. But we all know any kind of mass deportation attack would be devastating to our communities. I mean, as you know, Pekuun represents agricultural communities. Agricultural communities in Oregon they brought in revenues of $6 billion in the last calendar year. These kinds of industries that depend exclusively on an immigrant workforce are going to suffer greatly if their workers suddenly disappeared. So in terms of what is needed here, there are really a few elements. I think there's on the one side, there's this like, let's organize side, do what we do best. We organize and really activate our network statewide, our coalition statewide, to be able to build out. And through Oregon for All, we are going to have a committee structure that folks can plug into. And it's going to be really critical that we can build that through the relationships we have with our partner organizations. Another thing that we're also telling our community as well as our organizations is that, we got to get our artifacts together. We need to ensure that our organizations and our community members are keeping track of, any little certificate, any little thing that they might need. If there is a point that they need to prove legal presence, and that's going to be some of the more localized stuff, some of the things that we need to make sure to uplift with each other. Another thing that I've heard Tess say, I've heard other folks say, which is don't obey in advance. We're seeing that, Facebook the other day just dropped that they weren't going to be fact checking anymore, trying to obey in advance some of the threats that Donald Trump has made to social media platforms. But do not, we're telling people do not do that. And especially with our community who's saying, well, should we just leave this idea of self-deportation? We need people to be bold. We need organizations to be bold and take really strong pro-immigrant stances. And any place that we can see this, whether it's our school board tables, our superintendents, our local police, these things being said out loud that they are going to implement to the full extent the sanctuary state, that they're going to support our communities, that immigrants belong here. These are going to be really good ways to help combat some of the nasty narrative we're seeing on the national side. And just generally, we all are going to have to be really courageous in the way that we do our advocacy, and we're going to have to be bolder than ever, while also kind of resisting some of our instincts from the past. We know that folks are going to be targeted in a really, really big way, and especially our immigrant folks. And we're going to have to be really well trained and disciplined about how we show up in protest and in defending our community in the upcoming administration. And, we're going to hear a lot about, what Trump says he's going to do, but we also know that the country does not have the resources to implement any of those things. It's going to be a lot of noise. But we do have to be prepared for any scenario, and maybe one or two of those things is actually going to happen. And another place too, that as organizations, we have to really level up. We have to make sure our organizational paperwork is in order, our finances, our compliance, anything you can do to make sure we're squeaky clean, it is going to be really important as well, because we know that Congress tried to pass that act that would target our organizations as terrorists if they wanted to take away our nonprofit statuses. But one of the tools that the government does have is the IRS, and we need to make sure that we're setting up systems that are really, really good record keeping, so we don't give anybody a reason to attack our organizations. And a message just that we're talking about really seriously too with our base, specifically mixed immigration status families, farm workers, about what does it actually mean to have to make that emergency plan, specifically family planning. What would happen if I wasn't here, and what would happen with my kids? What would happen with some of my important assets? Again, also telling folks to separate the thunder from the lightning. There's a lot that's going to be said, but we just need to be able to really delineate what's true and not, and asking people to help us rumor bust. There's so many people that are, unfortunately, not many, but there are people that kind of take advantage of this moment to spread disinformation, misinformation. So we are asking our communities, especially our immigrant communities, to have your best resources at hand. If there are going to be, if you are seeing some information, get that fact checked and help us dispel any kind of misinformation, as well as making sure that our folks still feel comfortable reporting crimes. We're asking folks, like, if you're a victim of a crime, you should still report it. We are a sanctuary state, and we are looking for statements from our local law enforcement to be able to say, we're going to please report crimes to us. And in addition to that, we're asking folks too to report any kind of incidents that are happening to our organizations, whether that is just reaching out, sending a message if there is any ICE activity, or any racist vigilante attacks. Just recently in Woodburn, after the election, we had somebody that was knocking on doors asking people if they were undocumented and threatening to call ICE on them. So those kinds of reports, we also would like to get reports from, if people are seeing those on the ground as well. So I'll pause there, and I'll hand it off to Tess for her part, because I have more to say, but for the next questions.
I feel like Reyna covered so much of the ground. I think, yeah, really echoing all of that. I think the point about the don't obey in advance is something we've been thinking a lot about ensuring that there is not anticipatory compliance, because it, again, exactly as Reyna said, some of this is new, but a lot of it is not. And this we've seen this before. Also, other countries have seen this before. So I think we've actually been looking at, how have other societies that have gone through this sort of transition resisted? And what we've seen is that the use of this fear, coming in, people cede ground before the ground is actually taken. So let's not cede the ground. Let's stand our ground and support each other. And it's when there's so much fear, it's if we have to do that alone, it's much easier to cede the ground. When we support each other, and when we find also new ways of being in coalition, we can be stronger to push back against these threats, which are, again, like Reyna said, they cannot all be implemented day one. Will there be things coming out day one, day two, day three? Absolutely. But it takes time, and the more resistance we have, the more time it takes, and the more we can stop. And in the process, the more alternative institutions we can build. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is combating misinformation. Even with the number of legal developments that we expect to come out in the early days, and the way that the media covers everything about the Trump administration, we're afraid that people will inadvertently obey in advance when there are executive orders coming out, when there are different proposed rules, regulations. I mean, there are litigation explainers for litigators, let alone attorneys who are trying to implement that for working with folks in immigration proceedings, let alone like the communities and individuals who are being impacted. You know, what do these different legal developments mean? We've been thinking about helping cut through some of that, because what we saw last time, for example, was things like the public charge rule under the first Trump administration that was actually paused in court. But a lot of people saw that come out and said, oh my goodness, if I continue receiving these benefits that my family really relies on, I could be deported. So I'm just going to stop doing that to protect my family, when actually they didn't need to do that yet. They could have continued to support their family in that way, but making sure that there's the correct education that's also very timely, because things will be moving quickly. And so making sure that we have those channels of communication set up across legal and non-legal organizations. Educating individuals about rights, but also remedies. So what are your rights? Then also, how do you actually use those in practice? Because we may be seeing confrontation points that are different. You know, it's one thing to know you're right, but it's another thing when you're confronted by law enforcement, or, you know, the new administration has talked about using different executive powers to get the military involved, to use National Guard. And I think it's a very real important thing to think about, that having a police officer show up at your door, having an ICE officer show up at your door, having a military officer show up at your door, those might present different levels of risk. And how do we prepare our communities for what that may mean? But again, the ways, and we don't know exactly how this is going to unfold. The way we've been thinking about it is that in order to achieve the kind of mass detention and deportation of immigrant communities that the administration has promised, there are three big pieces of that on a broad level that we know will happen, even if we don't know how. One is the pathways to stigmatization. So the idea that people who are different deserve different treatment, and all of the narrative points that Reyna went over. I mean, that's so critical, you know, and I think one strength in Oregon is certainly that those narratives are very powerful already in the state and at a state level. So making sure that the pathways to stigmatization are rejected, and that there's an alternative vision that's put in place. The second step that we think the administration will use is leveraging this apparatus of mass incarceration. You know, they don't have to build it. Unfortunately, it already exists. It's, you know, before the first Trump administration, it already existed. It's been building. Private prison stock soared right after the election. Again, in Oregon, though, I think we have some really unique opportunities. Oregon is, you know, potentially the only state that doesn't have actually ICE detention. And so there are very few physical sites in Oregon where individuals could be held by federal immigration enforcement before they are sent to a longer term detention facility. And so being aware of that and being able to respond very quickly with organizing and with pressure and with attorneys who can go and play a strategic role to try to keep people in Oregon and prevent them from being transferred out of state borders, that is something that could be very powerful in Oregon. That might not be something that's available in other states, but is in Oregon. And then the third kind of area we expect is the elimination of courts and lawyers. And this is not because courts and lawyers solve things, but it is because courts and lawyers slow things down a lot. And I think the first Trump administration, we saw a lot of big lawsuits that had very positive effects by slowing or pausing or stopping altogether policies. This time around, we've learned a lot. They've learned a lot as well. And so I don't think we have any expectation. We shouldn't have an expectation that the courts will be the answer here. They won't be. They might help, but ensuring that there is access to legal representatives who can come in and help individuals and impacted communities avail themselves of their rights in the process. Because when you can slow down the legal processes at work, there is more time and space to push back, for the power dynamics to shift, for the organizing to happen, for the public pressure to build. And so I think that is one way that attorneys in the legal process can be very helpful, is kind of this idea of sand in the gears of this detention, deportation regime. And then just a last point is, again, that Reyna touched on, is protecting ourselves and each other. Working in partnership and in coalition is going to be more important than ever, as important as ever. And also by protecting our own organizations, we also protect each other in partnership, because we expect the federal administration to come and start targeting not only individuals and communities, but also the advocates, the organizers, the organizations who are doing this work. And we don't have to guess how they would do it. I think we can learn a lot from what's been happening in the state of Texas, from their state attorney general, the use of their state laws, but we can expect federal laws, for example, tax laws, different compliance mechanisms, challenging tax exempt status, all of these things, and even using potentially criminal consequences as well, to try to intimidate organizations into changing their mission, stepping away from their work, or spending so much energy on protecting themselves that they don't have the energy to do the work. So this is something that we're actively encouraging everyone to think about now, about organizational compliance, to think about your personal and organizational digital security, and to have the hard conversations amongst your groups, amongst your organizations, about what happens if a law enforcement officer shows up and says, give me your records. What are the steps to take? What kind of communication channels do you activate? How do you train someone to feel confident to say, no, I need to call my attorney, or hold on a second, actually, I don't feel well, I need to go to the bathroom, you need to wait here, you don't have permission to come inside. Just some of these practical ways to actually slow down the situation and get it under control. And so following this, we'll circulate. We've been creating through Oregon for All a safeguarding organizations toolkit that starts to give some really practical advice, building from organizations, resources that are already existing, about how organizations can start to implement these self-protective strategies in the current context.
Thanks so much, y'all. That's incredibly helpful framing. And I meant to mention at the top of this too, if you all have questions for Reyna and Tess as we're going through this, please feel free to drop them into the chat. We'll try to take a couple minutes at the end to ask them a few questions in the chat box. I'm sure we won't get to everyone's questions, but we'll at least try to pull a couple out. So feel free to drop in the chat as we're chatting, as we're talking, if you have things that are coming up that you're really curious to hear more about. I think you both also really spoke to how we should be preparing, kind of folded into this answer about what it looks like to protect people right now. So I'm going to jump ahead into the next question, which is, what lessons have we learned that can help us? And Reyna, I think we'll start with you, and then maybe we'll jump back to Tess and I kind of talking a little bit about the work at Sheridan, and we're going to have Emma jump in and talk a little bit too about some work around the ICE buses in Bend. But Reyna, if you want to kick us off for that one, what lessons have we learned that can help us right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost that when we work together, when we work in coalition, we can do really big things. We have won driver's licenses for Oregon. We beat anti-immigrant measures together. We have done a lot together. We have a long history doing this together with ROP, with Innovation Law Lab. And I think that that's why continuing to build on our coalition work is going to be really, really key, especially in this moment where everybody's trying to figure out what to do, how do we do it, or there's like people in Salem doing their own thing, and Washington County, and so there's a lot of this coordination that has to happen right now. And I think that that's really important to remember. So this is where I want to uplift and kind of define Oregon for All a little bit more for folks. And really this conversation got together last year, where one of the steering committee members came to me and was like, I think Donald Trump's going to win. And he's like, what are we going to do today to make sure that our immigrant communities are safe? And so since then, we were starting to build up the steering committee for Oregon for All to prepare for this moment. And when we started to delineate really what we wanted to do, we wanted to say, well, Oregon for All is a coalition space where we're building, we're trying to advance immigrant and refugee justice to build a more inclusive, a more welcoming and prosperous state through education, research, organizing, and advocacy work. And together, we're going to uplift and address these shared values to foster thriving and resilient communities. We know that when we leverage our collective power, we can reject anti-immigrant policies at every level of the government. We can advance a proactive vision for immigrant inclusion and success, like we have with universal representation, with driver's licenses, and that we can demonstrate that hate and violence have no place in our politics and in our communities, like we did with rejecting Measure 105. So through a process, we decided really to have three main lanes, because we thought, folks are already doing Know Your Rights. There's like people that are already working on some of these things, but in terms of a statewide lens, we really felt like cross-organizational coordination, convening, and bringing, kind of consolidating some of the stuff that's happening all across the state would be an important role for Oregon for All. Also, the narrative side of things, narrative and communications. Again, some of the politicians did us no favors by not being more responsive or being more proactive about the messages about the contributions our immigrant communities have made. So that's going to be a really big role of Oregon for All, to really help neutralize the hateful rhetoric, as well as the fear tactics that people are using and that we're seeing happening in different parts of the state already. And rapid response planning and coordination, specifically rapid response planning in case of a deportation or a mass deportation attack. So there's a lot of moving pieces to that, but like I mentioned, a really critical part of this is going to be the committee work. So I just wanted to actually share, yes, we're working on the website, but what I am going to share right now is just some information. The endorsement form for folks who would like to be invited to the events. As Tess mentioned, we had a really great webinar last week. A lot of organizations showed up, and it was very eye-opening and very kind of scary too, to realize, like, oh gosh, like our organizations really do have to put a lot more safety measures in place, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, especially when it comes to making sure we're not sharing our passwords and our drives, right? So all of that kind of stuff was a real reality check for us last week. But what's to come this Thursday, we're actually having a big partner briefing that folks can attend if they're interested. Our manager for Oregon for All is listed here, Ellie Gluhosky, her email address. And then we're going to have a big statewide kickoff on February 13th. And we're trying to gauge how many folks are going to be there. So if it is going to be a bigger event, we might have to change our location, but that's one of the big things that's happening next. And I also wanted to make sure to share the toolkit in here too. If you don't have access, I'll make sure to share it once I get off of the line here, but yeah, I see that. Yeah, we will make sure you have access. Thank you. And so yeah, that's what's to come there. And the steering committee is made up of some really strong partners: the ACLU of Oregon, Innovation Law Lab, the Oregon Food Bank has been very involved as well, the Oregon Just Transition Alliance. Hoeli Boa is the executive director there now, and he was actually one of the founding managers of the One Oregon Coalition, which was critical in us being able to defend our state from the Measure 105 and rejecting that hateful measure. Apano and Unite Oregon as well. So we're really excited to be able to roll out some of these activities and get everyone together. And yeah, there's going to be a lot more to come there.
Thanks so much, Reyna. Super helpful. Yeah, okay, incredible. Thanks for that. And I know, Tess, we were going to talk a little bit kind of back and forth. Reyna has mentioned kind of the ongoing partnerships between all of our orgs for many years. And one of the big things that we collaborated on with Innovation Law Lab and other orgs across the state was the work at Sheridan, which I saw Kathleen was a huge part of, who's on this call. Kathleen, I saw you drop it in the chat, like, what if folks are detained again in a federal prison? So we wanted to talk about that again, because that's an excellent flag. We don't have any detention centers or sites in the state of Oregon, but this would not be the first time that we've seen a Trump administration using our prison infrastructure to detain people. So just wanted to talk briefly about that work. So maybe I'll just share a little bit, Tess, about the organizing piece, and then you can talk a little bit more about the legal components and how that came in and the relationship between those things. So in 2018, the Trump administration was experimenting with different ways to kind of expedite more mass deportations. And one of the things they were trying was they sent 1,600 immigrants around the US to 5 different federal prisons. So 123 of those folks who were asylum seekers were detained at Sheridan Federal Correctional Institute, which is in McMinnville in Yamhill County, Oregon. And Unidos Bridging Community and other local organizers on the ground found out about it immediately, jumped into action. They held a protest outside of FCI Sheridan. They called up ROP, they called up other partners, and we formed the ICE Out of Sheridan Coalition to start holding the organizing work in response and to support the folks who were detained inside and to work for their release. And that looked like a whole bunch of things. The coalition put together vigils on Sundays outside the prison that would get hundreds of people. I think the biggest one had, Kathleen, I don't know if you remember, like maybe 900 people. People came from all over the state. It was really, really phenomenal and beautiful response statewide for folks supporting this action. Folks were doing sit-ins outside the ICE offices in Portland, calling and working with our legislators who were supportive, writing letters to the director of FCI Sheridan, putting pressure on him to work for the release of the asylum seekers. And Innovation Law Lab jumped in really immediately, trying to get access to folks inside to provide legal representation. And obviously Tess will talk about that because I don't know the details of how that side works. But they were able to come up with some really incredible, innovative ways to represent people. And a big piece of what was so effective in that was that part of the ability to get folks released was that there was community organizations that folks could get released to. And Tess, maybe you can speak a little bit more about that. But I know one of the reasons that as folks' asylum cases were getting approved was that it was really important that they were released back into the community and that there were folks to receive them because not everyone had a family member in the States or someone else who could be that host. And so we put together, there was a welcome committee that would drive, show up, the lawyers would call and say somebody's about to get released. Sometimes it was really short notice. So there was this really massive effort to coordinate folks who were willing to drive to and from and pick people up. Often folks didn't share the same languages. So we were putting together, handbooks in different languages and ways folks could communicate with each other when they were picking folks up, helping folks to feel as safe as possible and to return some dignity to the process, because obviously for so many folks, the lack of dignity was such a hard part of the process. So anyways, it was just really incredible organizing effort. Folks were being put up in churches and in the Gurdwara with the Sikh community. There was a lot of really incredible interfaith organizing. And eventually all of the folks were released and granted asylum, which was really phenomenal. So we have, seen how our organizing works to stop mass deportation. And I just think it's such an important thing for us to reflect on tonight is the ways that we've built this infrastructure. We continue to strengthen it and we'll continue to rely on it in the months and years to come. So Tess, I don't know if there's things you want to add in on that. I know we're already running short of time for this conversation, but I do want to kick it back to you if you have more to add there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just, because I know there's a lot still to cover. So just to be brief, I mean, this was absolutely an example of, I think, organizations coming together and achieving what would never have been possible if there hadn't been this sort of coordinated response. I'm going to for those who want to hear more, I'm going to drop in the chat a Sheridan report that I think it's great to start with the written version that Emma shared and then go from there to the Innovation Law Lab report about kind of the legal response, because that really is the order things need to go in. It's the organizing response and then the lawyers come in and see what they can do. And I think we are actively looking at Sheridan and other similar responses where there was kind of organizing legal response like in Bend for how we can use a similar approach for when enforcement actions occur. What happened in Sheridan from the legal side was that when after the first responders came, and attorneys were called in and tried to get access to individuals to talk to them about what their immigration relief options were, they were just denied access to the facility. And after being denied access for a number of days, they went to federal court. So it went to there was a temporary restraining order where Judge Simon in the district court for the District of Oregon actually ordered a certain parameters of access to attorneys that the individuals detained in Sheridan had to receive. And so there was a certain amount of time they had to receive from attorneys, certain spaces they had to meet with attorneys. And importantly, no one was allowed to be transferred out of Sheridan without the approval of either the judge or the lawyers on the other side, which meant that the power dynamic really shifted because the government could no longer just unilaterally transfer individuals out. They had to continue holding them in this site of resistance where there was all of this organizing going on, where there was all of this legal representation that was required and being overseen by a court. And so that was very powerful. And we think that that really also did help change the just overall power imbalance that we're always fighting when it's the whole government apparatus against individual representation. Here, it was 100% of the individuals detained there passed their credible fear screenings, which meant they could actually have the opportunity to present their full asylum claims. And 97% of them won release. And these numbers are just really unheard of. I mean, these are all individualized cases. And we really think so much of that was possible because the moment was frozen and because there was also this support on the outside. Like Hannah was saying, there were organizations who were willing to be sponsors, so everyone could get a sponsor very quickly. It was really incredible what was achieved there. And so using this combination of litigation to kind of freeze things, lawyers to work toward individual legal outcomes while the power is just building from the coordinated organized response outside is something that we're very interested in figuring out how to rapidly use again, because again, it has to happen very quickly, I think, for this to be effective. And even, I don't know if we have time to go into the Bend example, but maybe I know ROP has some great resources on it. That was a situation where ICE van showed up and it was really, Sheridan, there were several days before the litigation began, but Bend, it was, a number of hours before things really needed to happen and the community came together on that timeline. So I think more of that in the days to come is needed.
Thanks for that, Tess. Yeah, I know we're running out of time. Emma, is there a 1-minute version of the Bend story that you want to pull out? Anything summarizing to share with us? Or do you feel like we should hold that for another call because it's too tricky to share it that quickly?
Yeah, I think let's drop the links in the chat, and then when we're in Sidra's chunk about action planning or how
Yeah.
groups organized, we could fold it into that part. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds perfect. I love that plan. That sounds great. Yeah, and we can talk a little bit more as it's helpful about drawing out some of the examples as Sidra talks about sort of the core pieces of what makes for a strong group organizing. We can talk about how that showed up in Sheridan and how that showed up in Bend. Amazing. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, well then to wrap us up, Reyna and Tess, thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to share that I didn't ask you about or that you didn't get a chance to say that you want to kind of offer us in 30 seconds? And if you're like, nope, I got to hit the highlights, that's also fabulous. But I just want to make sure we don't leave anything burning on the table.
I definitely got to hit the biggest highlights, but I also wanted to just call attention to the toolkit. Everybody should have access. And there is the immigrant rights package that is the proactive effort. You heard a lot about the defensive work that we're working on, but we also feel really strongly that we need to keep the proactive efforts, and the immigrant rights package would make really important investments to keep those safety net programs, to make sure that we expand programs to families, and to ensure that we have legal representation for people facing deportation through the ECHO program. So please take a look. Would love your support there as well. And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything that we can connect with you about.
Thanks, Reyna. How about you, Tess?
Yeah, and just briefly, I'm going to drop the Safeguarding Organizations Toolkit in the thread in case that is helpful for anyone. We're hoping to do some more trainings and keep developing resources for capacity building for organizations. The last thing I wanted to hit was on the Equity Corps of Oregon, ECHO, that Reyna mentioned. This is Oregon's Universal Representation Program. There is state funding for any immigrant Oregonian to receive under the income threshold to receive free legal support. And it's really an incredible network of legal service providers. And getting registered with ECHO is a very important step in order to be able to receive very quickly legal services in a crisis moment. So we're really recommending that people make sure that they're signed up for ECHO membership if they're not already, anyone who qualifies, because it is a way, both in terms of individual immigration representation and also broader litigation, that the state of Oregon is funding a lot of this work, and there are already really strong legal support networks that can be leveraged.
Awesome. Thank you so much.